Hello everyone. Thanks for hanging around to this last talk for the day. So as the title of the talk would suggest, we're attempting to summarize PyCon 2015 in Montreal in 30 minutes. Why would we want to do that? Well, there's lots of conferences around the world on PyCon every year. The PyCon US is really the biggest one, and paradoxically, they haven't been holding it in US for a couple of years. They've actually been holding it in Montreal. So it's the biggest gathering of Python freaks in the world, and it's really where you have to be if you want to be on the cutting edge of what's happening in Python. So all of us in this room are interested in Python somehow. None of us really have a good excuse for not being there. So that's why I'm here. Yes, cost is one thing. We did some back of the envelope calculations last night, how much it would cost to attend. It comes to around 30 grand probably, if you have to take into account your plane tickets and your accommodation and everything like that. So one way of looking at this talk is not really as a 30-minute talk, but maybe more as like a 30 grand cost saving for yourself. Another way of looking at it is a time saving. You could have gone to PyCon Montreal, but it would probably have taken about, I don't know, two weeks or so out of your life with all the flying and everything. It's quite a long conference. So not only are you sitting here and saving 30 grand, you are also adding 2 weeks to your useful life expectancy, which is very good. So let's get started. Where this all fits in, there's about 40 annual Python conferences. If you go to pycon.org, you can get a list of those. I think it's between 40 and 50, depending on which you count. These include PyCon. So PyCon ZA is also kind of part of the PyCon franchise. Then there's EuroPython, because the Europeans want to do it slightly differently. There's also DjangoCon and DjangoCon in Europe as well. I think it's DjangoCon EU. And then there's dedicated conferences for the more number crunching stuff, the SciPy and PyData. The biggest one, as I said, is PyCon US. And this year, it was held in Montreal. It featured 2 full days of just tutorial sessions with 36 different tutorials on the schedule, each of them lasting 3 hours. So that right there is already about 100 hours worth of material. The main conference lasts for 3 days. It's 5 tracks, so at any given time you have to choose between what's probably 5 pretty good talks. And you can only watch one at a time. And there's over 3,000 attendees, so it's really quite massive. And after the 3-day main conference, there's also 4 days of sprints, and many people end up staying for those. It's apparently a lot of fun. So if you wanted to, if you couldn't attend and you still wanted to be updated, you can still go to pyvideo.org. They have a list of about 134 different recordings from this year's PyCon. And all of it is on YouTube, so it's all free, and you can go watch it. So if you're a real Python fanboy, go to YouTube, search for PyCon US 2015, and sit yourself down on the couch. We're all used to this term called binge watching. So what it would be like to go through all the PyCon Montreal material, it would take about as long as watching all 5 seasons of Breaking Bad 3 times. You'd watch it twice for the tutorials, and then another once for all the talks. And if you're not keen on Breaking Bad, you could get yourself a hell of a lot of Kevin Spacey. You could watch all of the House of Cards seasons 5 times. In the same time it would take you to go through all of the talks of PyCon Montreal. Okay, so it's not really possible to condense everything into 30 minutes. I actually lied. I'm just going to give you my quick overview of my 10 favorite talks that I found. And afterwards, if any of them pique your interest, they are on YouTube, and you can go and find them and watch yourself and educate yourself. It's pretty cool. So to start off with, you have to start with a start. Guido's keynote. For those of you who are new to Python, Guido van Rossum is the guy who started Python quite a while ago. He is Dutch, but otherwise he's quite fine. He's known as the benevolent dictator for life of PyCon. And his talk he talks quite a lot, but it can be summarized as Python 3, Python 3, Python 3, and then diversity, diversity, diversity. Both of these are really good topics, so I'm glad he talked quite a lot about it. On the Python 3 topic, the most memorable quote was, yes, you should all be using Python 3, and I know you all want to, but I know it's difficult, and then blah, 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 blah. So we've decided to give you 5 more years. So he's kind of pragmatic about it. I think the consensus is that if you're starting something new, Python 3 should be the default. There's no real good reason not to use it. But obviously a lot of us have big legacy code bases, and it doesn't make sense to just spend a lot of time porting that just yet. But it depends on your situation. On diversity, he didn't say too much. One thing he said that I found interesting was that there hasn't been any female committers to the Python core, which I didn't know. And then he made like a personal commitment to actually mentor and train any female developers who want to commit to Python core. So I thought that was quite a cool thing. In the States and in Europe, the whole diversity issue is very much a male-female thing at the moment. And we're in South Africa. I think we all know that diversity goes a lot further than that. You gotta not just have a few girls on your team and think you're diverse. So yeah, he didn't really have any solutions for how we can make our teams more diverse. And I know it's a really difficult problem. My own 2 cents on this topic is that it is a very difficult problem to solve. If you are sitting with a bunch of middle-aged guys, to suddenly make it diverse is very difficult. So rather go for solving the easier problem. And each time you set up a new team to build a new product, or you set up a new startup, or a new project or something, try and make it diverse from the start. Try and make sure your first couple of hires or the first people you get interested are not like you. And then it's actually quite easy to keep a team diverse once it starts off diverse. But otherwise, it's a much more difficult problem to solve. So that wasn't Guido, that was just my 2 cents. The next talk that was really good is this keynote by a guy called Jacob Kaplan-Moss. Now, he's one of the guys who started Django way back when, and he's still a core developer. And he's got a very fancy job, and he gives a lot of talks at conferences. And generally, you'd have a lot of respect for this guy. Technically, you probably wouldn't just take him on in an argument. But he basically came out saying that quite often he finds himself in situations where he feels maybe he's not that smart. Maybe his technical know-how is a little bit inadequate. Maybe he does write bad code every now and then. You know. And he gave it a name. They call it the imposter syndrome, and it ended up being a bit of a theme of the conference. And I think we can all recognize it. We all feel that from time to time, especially in a place like this. You're in a room full of lots of clever people. It's quite easy to think that maybe these people know something that I don't know. Maybe I make obvious mistakes that they all see and know about. That kind of thing. And my key takeout from this is, if even this guy feels that, whenever I get that feeling, just get over it. We all feel it. Life carries on. You're not stupid. Cool. A third talk that I found very interesting was this one by Nina Zakharenko called Technical Debt, the code monster in your closet. So what is technical debt? It's basically a series of bad decisions. And those could have been technical decisions or business decisions. That happened in the past, that's keeping you from doing your job today, that's keeping you from rolling out that new feature or from fixing that bug or whatever it is. And we all know what it looks like. I mean, we've all worked on code bases that don't quite work in the way you would expect. So I found this talk really, really interesting. She starts off by basically saying that we all cause it. We're all the reason for it. We all write bad code sometimes, and there are reasons for it. There are tight deadlines. There are sometimes features that are bad ideas, but you just don't want to say no to your boss. Sometimes there's scope creep. Those kind of things happen. So in a talk, she goes through how you can spot technical debt, kind of code smells and stuff. Yeah, it's quite useful for being a bit more critical on your own code. And then she proposes some solutions, like setting realistic expectations. You can't write really good code in a day if you also have to write really good tests and make sure it's maintainable and everything. pair programming, code reviews, those kind of things. And then definitely testing, automated testing. Yeah, so I found that quite good. Next up is, oh yeah, there's this one really interesting quote. She didn't say it first time, I'm not sure who coined it, but always code is of the guy who ends up maintaining your code will be a violent psychopath who knows where you live. I luckily don't have this problem. My previous job was with Code for SA, but they are hiring, and I don't know who they're going to hire next. So you know. Yeah. Okay. So next up, there's this guy called Raymond Hettinger. He gave 2 talks, but this one was on PEP 8. Most of you will probably know what PEP 8 is. It's basically like a style guide for Python. It says that you should have an opinion on line lengths and capitalization and variable names and line spacing between functions and methods and things like that. And it's all very good. If you have code that conforms to PEP 8, it's generally a bit more readable than code that doesn't. So there's nothing wrong with PEP 8, but he makes a very big point on not spending too much time on it. The real thing you should be focusing on is making sure you architect your code in a Pythonic way that makes sense. And how he does it in his talk, you'd really have to watch it yourself to see it, but he basically starts off with a piece of example code and he asks the audience if they see any issues with it, and they say no, it actually looks good, it's PEP 8 compliant and everything's fine. And then he goes through it one by one and kind of picks off the things that the whole audience have missed. And this is an audience full of clever Python developers, so I found that really, really good. So it's obvious stuff sometimes, like making use of iterators and or just just looping through a list rather than declaring a counter and then things like that. So it's quite useful if you find yourself sometimes not being too confident on your own kind of grade of Python code. This is a good talk to go through to see which kind of stuff would normally trip people up, especially if you're coming from a different programming kind of background. If you actually more better at coding Java or whatever, then you're probably thinking about things slightly differently. So basically PEP 8 is great, but let's be pragmatic and let's focus on Pythonic structure, not just stylistic correctness. Okay, now this guy is called Harry Percival, and he gave a tutorial. It's one of those wonderful 3-hour tutorials on test-driven development in Python for beginners. So if you have 3 hours on a Saturday, basically it takes you from someone who hasn't written any tests whatsoever to someone who can understand what's the difference between a unit test and an integration test, how to write them, how to write your code so that it's more testable, and then he basically takes you through some steps building this little web app in Django. A confession on my side is I didn't write any tests until about a year ago, because it's really your job to write tests. Usually your job is to, just build out features, get stuff done, and tests kind of take time away from that. So this was a real eye-opener for me. I really enjoyed it quite a lot. It hasn't turned me into a real TDD junkie. Some people are really religious on tests, but it has changed the way I code. Basically, by letting me focus or teaching me to focus more on tiny iterations. So get a function in place and have it do something. That's fine. You can write a test for that, and that happened. Then you can go back and make it do something a bit more complicated, and you just kind of iterate, and in the end you end up with a really great product, and it was tested at each step, and it just works. So so I think that writing testable code makes you think a bit differently about the code that you write, and that's a very good thing. So if you are new to testing, that's a very good tutorial to check out. The guy also wrote the book on test-driven development, so it's quite nice. You can get all the materials and stuff through watching this tutorial. There's links to everything. Okay. Next up, Julia Evans. If you want to, she called it spying on your programs here, but if you're looking for it on Google, it's called Systems Programming as a Swiss Army Knife. And basically what she's referring to as systems programming is What if you treat your program as a black box, and you just look at what's going in and what's going out? How much memory is this thing using? Is it writing to disk? Is it making network calls? Things like that. Can you still debug what's going on there? And how would you go about that? So it's really not a Python talk per se. It's more of a talk on using your operating system and the calls it comes with. Yeah, basically all it comes down to is if you write a Python program that does anything, it does it through the operating system, and it does it through what's called system calls. And those things you can have a look at. You can, without knowing anything of what's going on inside the program itself. So that's quite useful. Yes, some examples of Linux commands that you could use to debug stuff specifically on Linux. So there's strace, which lets you literally see a list of all the system calls being made. So things like write and open are quite useful. For example, say you're writing or some program is running, and it reads in some config file from somewhere. You don't know where the config file is, but if you use strace to run the thing, you'll somewhere have to see an open call to some kind of file to read the config file, and then you know where it is. So that kind of thing can be really useful. There's ngrep for taking a look at what's going on a specific port, just taking a look at the raw network traffic with all the headers and everything. There's time, which is really simple for benchmarking. So if you're running a Python script, you'd say Python and then the name of the script, and you'd run. If you want to time it, you just say time, Python, and the script, and run. And then it would just run through the script, and at the end give you some feedback on how long it took, which is pretty useful, especially if you're trying to build an API or something and you want it to be snappy. The last one there is dstat, which you'd run in a terminal, and it would just continuously tell you how much data is being written or read at any given moment by the operating system. And an interesting use case for this was she was debugging this one script that she benchmarked with time, and it ran quite fast. So you're writing this thing, you want it to be snappy, you run it, it's fast, you feel good about yourself, you go get a coffee, then you come back and you run it again and you run it again, and you see that the second time it's actually slow. But why? It's doing exactly the same thing. And it turns out that, for example, if you are writing a lot of stuff to disk, your program will ask the operating system to write stuff to disk. The operating system will come back and say, okay, cool, we've got it. But it puts it in a buffer. And then it's still writing to disk by the time that your program's already exited. So you can think that you've written a Python program that's really snappy, but the operating system's kind of covering for you. And then if that gets called repeatedly, you'd pick it up immediately with dstat that there's just a lot of stuff going to disk. So I found that quite interesting. After watching that talk, you'll feel slightly more like the guy from Mr. Robot and a bit less like just a regular douchebag. Cool. Next up is this talk by Christoph Pettis on Postgres. It's not a talk, it's also a 3-hour tutorial. So Postgres for me is it's become a bit of a default, purely because of the PostGIS stuff, the geographical plugin. Basically any app or service or something that you build nowadays is going to have some kind of geographical component to it. You saw it with the stuff that Greg demoed earlier, with all the maps and stuff. That's all stuff that really needs to be handled in the database if it's to be done efficiently. So on the other hand, though, Postgres is a real big beast, and it can be very intimidating. The command line interface to Postgres is not super user-friendly or pretty or anything. And there is a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of stuff that could go wrong in a database if you're not an expert on databases. So I found this talk really, really interesting. He takes you through a lot of the basics. And he tells you some of the stuff that Postgres is good at, and some of the stuff it sucks at. Like apparently doing a count star on a very large table in Postgres is actually really inefficient. There's other databases that does that much quicker. And doing paging in Postgres is apparently also quite inefficient. There are other databases that do it better. So it's nice to know that, then you can design your way around it. Then he spends a lot of time talking about database replication, which is also something that Greg mentioned earlier. The whole thing around database replication is really complicated, and he takes you through how to set it up so that you can have a failover database, and you can basically guarantee uptime for your service, whatever it is. But the takeout from that is, if you can at all avoid that, and rather pay Amazon to manage that complexity for you, you've really saved yourself a lot of time. So before watching this talk, that might have been something that I would have taken on. I would have like, yeah, let's quickly figure out replication in the morning. After watching the talk, I think I have a healthy respect for that, and I would rather let Amazon take care of it, or whatever other services are out there. And then he also talks a bit about the native JSON data type in Postgres, which is really cool. We tend to use JSON quite a lot if you're building web services that talk to each other. And in Postgres, you can just push that JSON into a field on the database just like it is. It's really cool. And then you can query the individual JSON fields inside of that on the database. So that really makes things much more efficient than going and querying the database, passing all the JSON, and then kind of querying the JSON fields in your Python application. So that's a nice thing to be aware of. Yeah, but that's about it for Postgres. So the talk's titled PostgreSQL Proficiency for Python People, and it's by Christoph Pettis. Then there's this guy, David Beasley. Now he's a regular at Python conferences. You'll find lots and lots and lots of talks that he's given on YouTube. This particular one that he gave is called Python Concurrency from the Ground Up. So Python concurrency is, for example, the twisted stuff that one of the previous speakers mentioned, or Tornado, or I think there's a couple of other frameworks you can use for doing asynchronous stuff. And basically it comes down to writing a program that can run process without sacking, without blocking on specific things like network calls or waiting for stuff to be written to disk or whatever. So there's during this talk, he basically goes through the only two methods of implementing concurrency in Python. So it's the methods that Tornado would be using or Twisted would be using under the hood. The one is thread pools and the one is coroutines. And then he goes through some different ways of doing both, and the kind of the upsides and the downsides to all of them. And in the end, the takeaway is, if you can write your program not to use concurrency, that's the first prize. Otherwise, try and have functions that are as simple as possible, and make sure that nowhere in your application do you have objects or things that are sharing state, because then things just get terribly confusing when things are happening asynchronously and the state is updated by one and you're not kind of expecting it yet, and yeah. So yeah, but if possible, avoid concurrency. It is complicated, it is difficult to maintain. Things break in unexpected ways. So if you can break the task down into stuff that can be done in separate processes, then rather just have like 5 Python processes chunking through the data doing it. Or maybe even multiple machines, spawn lots of virtual machines on some cloud provider and just do it that way. It will probably save you some time. Now he also gave a nice and long tutorial, a 3-hour tutorial at the same conference. Modules and packages, live and let die. Now these tutorials are 3 hours long, so you might ask, a module is simply a file with some Python in it that you can run. A package is just a folder with some files with Python in it, and then maybe an init file. So what on earth would you be doing for 3 hours talking about that? But it's quite fascinating. Like, he goes through all the ins and outs of how these things work, what gets imported first, what gets imported last, how can these things conflict. And if you've come across if you've ever worked on a really complicated Python application, you will know that these things can get pretty tricky after a while. You run into circular imports, and you don't always know what's loaded when and that kind of stuff. So watching through this tutorial can help you a lot to wrap your head around that. And I found that very useful. And he's quite an entertaining speaker, so it won't be 3 hours wasted. Then lastly, but not least, I think I might be violating the code of conduct because I want to do a shameless plug for my web framework of choice. There's a there's a 3-hour tutorial on Flask. What's cool about it is if you are new to Flask and you're looking for something to teach you, one of the first things you'll come across is the Flask mega tutorial, and it's written by this guy Miguel Greenberg, and then he's also just published a book on Flask with O'Reilly, and here the guy gives you basically 3 hours of one-on-one, almost. I mean, you have the opportunity of watching through that, and he just builds a sample web app with Python and Git, and some testing and stuff, and it's really a very good entry point. So if you are new to web development and you want to try out Flask, it's a nice place to start. And then that's that. The whole YouTube playlist for these 10 talks are over there, so you can snap that with your phone and you'll find it. Otherwise, you could just Google it. Yeah, and that's it. Any questions?
Any questions?
I should give one quick disclaimer. I did not actually attend the conference. I just have weird habits, and I do watch a lot of these talks while I'm cooking and, yeah, like at weird times. So.
Yeah. My question is, how many hours of PyCon Montreal have you watched?
I wanted to log it, and at first my idea was to try and watch all of it. But then I actually did the math and realized how prohibitive that was. No, so I would have to say probably about 50 to 60 hours. I didn't watch everything, and it's quite easy because it's YouTube. You try out a talk, and if it's not your thing, you just turn it off. It's not, you don't lose anything.
Wasn't paying quite enough attention. Did you watch the talk of asynchronous I/O from the ground up?
No, I did not.
That's really good to get out.
Okay, cool. One other plus point of watching these conference talks on YouTube, especially the tutorials, is tutorials tend to take a long time, and a lot of the time is spent on debugging people's personal setup and things like that. But if it's a video, you can just skip to the next part you're interested in. So it is quite an efficient way of going through this stuff.
Cool. If that's it, thank you very much, Beatrice.
Cool, thanks.